A doctor in 1840s London is standing over a corpse, and he is confident. Confident is the wrong word, he is certain. The stomach lining is inflamed, there's been vomiting, cramping, a slow, miserable decline over several days. He writes gastric fever on the certificate, hands it to a grieving widow, and goes home for dinner. He has just watched someone get away with murder. He will never know it. Neither will anyone else in the room. That was the entire point. For roughly 300 years, arsenic was the most reliable murder weapon in Europe, not because it was exotic, not because it was hard to detect once you knew what you were looking for, but because almost nobody knew what they were looking for. It mimicked diseases everyone already expected to see. It had no taste worth noticing, no smell worth noticing, and it was, for most of that period, completely legal to walk into a shop and buy. This is a story about a chemical element, but it's really a story about the gap between what people could prove and what they merely believed, and how an entire continent spent 3 centuries slowly closing that gap, one exhumed body at a time. Here's the strange part. Arsenic wasn't designed to kill people slowly and invisibly. Nobody sat down and engineered the ideal murder weapon. Arsenic trioxide, the white powdery compound that did most of the damage, was simply everywhere because it was extraordinarily useful for almost everything else except murder. It killed rats, it killed insects, it preserved hides. Later, it colored wallpaper a shade of green so vivid that Victorian homeowners couldn't get enough of it. It went into cosmetics, into wasting tonics sold to fashionable women who wanted a paler complexion, into sheep dip, into glass manufacturing. By the mid-1800s, arsenic compounds were arguably one of the most widely distributed toxic substances in ordinary households, not hidden in a locked cabinet, but sitting on a shelf next to the flour. Which raises an obvious question. Why would anyone sell a deadly poison over the counter to literally anyone who asked? Because for most of history, it wasn't obvious that death by arsenic looked any different from death by natural causes. The symptoms, vomiting, diarrhea, abdominal pain, gradual weakness, were indistinguishable from cholera, dysentery, food poisoning, or a dozen other common Georgian and Victorian killers. A slow arsenic death could stretch over days or weeks, dose by careful dose, and to a physician working entirely from clinical observation, it looked exactly like a bad stomach illness finishing what it started. There was no blood test, no autopsy technique that could isolate a specific poison in tissue, no chemistry capable of proving with certainty that a metal compound was sitting inside a dead person's organs. Doctors were working with symptoms, guesswork, and reputation. And reputation, it turns out, is a remarkably poor forensic tool. Fast fact: arsenic occurs naturally in the Earth's crust and enters waterways in many regions without any human involvement at all, which means centuries before anyone was poisoning anyone on purpose, some populations were already chronically exposed to low levels of it through their well water. Some historians studying skeletal remains have had to account for this baseline exposure before concluding a historical death involved deliberate poisoning at all. So arsenic didn't become the poison of choice because it was cleverly formulated for murder. It became the poison of choice because everything else about the world, the medicine, the law, the chemistry, simply wasn't built to catch it. But before we get to the Victorians and their green wallpaper, we have to go back further, to a period historians sometimes only half-jokingly call the Golden Age of inheritance powder. 17th century France had a problem, and the problem was extremely rich people surrounded by extremely patient relatives. Arsenic compounds circulating under names like poudre de succession, literally inheritance powder, became associated with a wave of suspicious deaths among the aristocracy, cresting in what became known as the Affair of the Poisons in the 1670s and 1680s. Here's where it gets genuinely strange. The investigation that followed wasn't really about proving arsenic poisoning in a laboratory sense. Nobody had the chemistry for that yet. It unraveled through confessions, through a network of fortune tellers and alleged poison sellers in Paris who were eventually arrested and interrogated, implicating a widening circle of nobility. King Louis XIV was sufficiently alarmed that he established a special court, the Chambre Ardente, the burning chamber, specifically to try these cases, and ultimately suppressed much of the investigation's findings because the implicated maims got uncomfortably close to his own. How many of the accused were actually guilty of poisoning versus swept up in a moral panic that fed on itself? This is genuinely debated among historians. The interrogations heavily relied on torture and hearsay. The accusations multiplied rapidly once the investigation gained momentum, and at least some scholars argue the affair reveals more about elite paranoia and court politics than about an actual poisoning epidemic. What's known, arsenic compounds were being sold and used with lethal intent by some individuals. What's debated, the true scale of it, and how many convictions were built on evidence that wouldn't survive contact with modern standards of proof. Which is, in miniature, the entire problem with the history of arsenic. It's often easier to prove that people believed poisoning was happening than to prove that a specific death was actually caused by arsenic. Why did arsenic dominate this particular criminal niche rather than, say, a blade or a beating? Because inheritance murder had a specific requirement that violence didn't satisfy: deniability. A stabbed body raises questions immediately. A body that simply stops thriving over several weeks raises questions much more slowly, if at all. And by the time anyone thought to ask, the funeral had happened, the will was executed, and the grieving relative was already spending the money. Slow poison wasn't just effective, it was socially effective. It let the poisoner remain present, sympathetic, and above suspicion for the entire duration of the crime.
Here's a question worth sitting with. For the most of the 18th century, why couldn't doctors just look? The honest answer is that looking wasn't the limiting factor. Seeing was. Arsenic trioxide mixed into food or drink doesn't announce itself. It doesn't turn tissue a distinctive color. It doesn't leave a visible signature under the kind of magnification available to an 18th century physician. You needed chemistry capable of extracting a specific substance from decomposing organic material and definitively identifying it, and that chemistry simply didn't exist yet. This wasn't unique to arsenic. Toxicology as a scientific discipline barely existed in any recognizable form before the early 1800s. The entire field had to be built from scratch, largely in response to the arsenic problem specifically, because arsenic was so common a suspect in the poisoning cases actually reaching courts. The first serious cracks appeared with Swedish chemist Carl Wilhelm Scheele, who in 1775 demonstrated a chemical method that could detect arsenic in a sample under controlled laboratory conditions. It was a real breakthrough, and also, in one of history's better ironies, the same Scheele who later developed the vivid green pigment, later widely known as Scheele's green, that would go on to poison thousands of people through their own wallpaper. The man who advanced arsenic detection also helped mass-produce one of its primary delivery systems. He did not live to see either legacy fully play out. Myth 1. Did Scheele's green wallpaper poison people through simple contact, touching, or smelling it? Verdict: partly true, but the mechanism is more interesting than toxic paint. Reality: the greater danger came from damp wallpaper. In humid conditions, mold could metabolize the arsenic compounds in the pigment and release trimethylarsine, a toxic gas, into room air. Chronic, low-level exposure in poorly ventilated Victorian bedrooms is now understood to have caused real illness, headaches, and possibly death in some documented cases, though establishing exact death tolls from wallpaper alone remains difficult given how many other arsenic sources existed in the same household simultaneously. Why the myth became popular? The idea of a house literally poisoning its own occupants through decoration is vivid and frightening, and Victorian newspapers loved it. It's also broadly true, just via a chemical pathway, mold metabolism, that wouldn't be properly understood until much later. Evidence. Modern toxicological analyses of surviving Victorian wallpaper samples confirms high arsenic content, and period medical writers, including physicians investigating specific illness clusters in arsenic-wallpapered homes, documented symptom improvement after residents changed rooms or removed the paper. Scheele's 1775 test was a start, not a solution. It required a relatively large, purified sample, and it wasn't sensitive enough to reliably detect the small quantities of arsenic that might remain in human tissue after a poisoning. Courts throughout the late 1700s and early 1800s were still in practice, relying on witness testimony, circumstantial behavior, and physician opinion about symptoms, the same shaky foundation as a century earlier. Fast fact: because the smell and taste of arsenic trioxide were mild enough to be masked by strong food or drink, some period poisoning manuals, and more grimly, some real cases brought to trial, describe it being administered in items like tea, coffee, or heavily spiced dishes, precisely because those flavors could disguise what little taste it had. This wasn't a coincidence of criminal creativity. It reflected a genuine exploitable weakness in early modern food culture, where strongly flavored, sweetened, or bitter preparations were already common. Now here's where everything quietly changes. In 1832, an English chemist named James Marsh was called in as an expert witness in a poisoning case. A farm laborer named John Bodley was accused of poisoning his grandfather with arsenic in his coffee. Marsh performed a chemical test on the remains and found arsenic. He testified to that effect in court. Bodley was acquitted anyway. Why? Because Marsh's test, while chemically sound, produced a result that wasn't visually dramatic or stable enough to survive being carried into a jury room and passed around. By the time the jury examined the yellow precipitate that indicated arsenic's presence, it had partially degraded, and the defense successfully cast doubt on it. The chemistry was right, the presentation failed. This is worth sitting with for a second, because it's a pattern that shows up constantly in the history of forensic science. Being correct and being convincing are two different achievements, and courts have always required both. Marsh, frustrated, went back to his laboratory and spent the next several years refining the method. What he produced in 1836, now known as the Marsh test, was significantly more elegant. It worked by combining a suspected sample with zinc and sulfuric acid. If arsenic was present, the resulting gas, when heated and passed through a glass tube, would deposit a distinctive, stable, visible, black-silver mirror-like film of metallic arsenic on the glass. That mirror could be preserved, photographed, and shown directly to a jury. It didn't degrade before their eyes. It didn't require the jury to trust an expert's word for what a fading precipitate meant. They could simply look at the tube. How sensitive was the Marsh test really? Modern historians of science generally agree it represented a genuine leap in sensitivity, capable of detecting arsenic in quantities far smaller than earlier methods required, which is precisely why it became so consequential in court. It's also worth noting what it couldn't do. It couldn't, on its own, distinguish accidental environmental exposure from deliberate poisoning, and it couldn't determine dosage or timing with the precision that later forensic toxicology would eventually achieve. Its power was narrower and more specific than popular accounts sometimes suggest. It proved arsenic was present. It did not, by itself, prove murder. Still, narrow as it was enough to change the entire calculation for anyone considering arsenic as a murder weapon. For the first time in history, a poisoner's greatest asset, the assumption that arsenic death looked exactly like natural death, was no longer reliably true. A body could now, in principle, be made to testify against its killer. Here's a question the narrator can't quite let go of. If arsenic was this dangerous and this commonly implicated in poisoning cases making the news, why did ordinary households keep buying it in enormous quantities for decades after the danger was well understood?
The answer isn't ignorance. It's that arsenic was, by the standards of the time, remarkably good at its legitimate jobs, and there wasn't an equally cheap, equally effective alternative for most of those jobs. It killed rats more reliably than the alternatives available. It was a startlingly effective insecticide in an era before synthetic pesticides existed. Farmers needed it, tanners needed it, fabric dyers needed it. The economic incentive to keep manufacturing and selling it dramatically outweighed in the calculations that mattered to shopkeepers and regulators the relatively rare, if horrifying, cases where it was used to kill a person. This is the quietly uncomfortable truth buried in most "why didn't they just ban it sooner" questions about history. Bans require political will, and political will requires that the harm outweigh the perceived economic cost in the minds of the people with power to legislate. Arsenic's harm was concentrated in individual, often domestic tragedies, a poisoned husband here, a poisoned business partner there, while its benefit was diffuse and constant, spread across agriculture and industry. Diffuse benefit tends to beat concentrated harm in the court of public policy right up until the harm becomes too visible to ignore. And arsenic eventually did become too visible to ignore, not primarily because of murder cases, but because of accidental mass poisonings that were harder to rationalize away. Fast fact. In 1858, in Bradford, England, a batch of peppermint candy known as humbugs was accidentally made using arsenic trioxide instead of a filler substance called DAF. The two powders looked similar and were stored near each other at a supplier. Over 20 people died and roughly 200 were sickened, almost entirely from candy sold to children. The scale and randomness of the Bradford sweets poisoning did more to galvanize public demand for arsenic regulation than most individual murder trials had managed, because it wasn't a story about one villain, it was a story about how casually dangerous the entire supply chain had become. That single accident contributed directly behind momentum behind Britain's Arsenic Act of 1851, tightened further after Bradford, which required sellers to keep a register of arsenic purchases, restricted sales to known customers, and mandated that arsenic sold for non-medical use be dyed a distinctive color, usually with soot or indigo, specifically so it couldn't be mistaken for flour, sugar, or any other harmless household powder. Myth 2. Question: did the Arsenic Act make arsenic poisoning essentially disappear in Britain? Verdict: false, or at least significantly overstated. Reality: the act made casual, impulsive purchase harder. You now had to be a known customer and your purchase was logged, but it didn't ban arsenic outright, and it did little to stop poisoners who had planned ahead, had legitimate occupational access, or simply used arsenic they already possessed. Poisoning cases involving arsenic continued for decades after the act, including some of the most notorious British cases of the century. Why the myth became popular? A tidy legislative fix makes for a satisfying historical narrative. Problem identified, law passed, problem solved. Real regulatory history is almost never that clean. Evidence, court records, and criminal histories from the 1850s through the 1880s continue to document arsenic poisoning cases in Britain well after the Act's passage, and forensic chemists of the period continued to treat arsenic detection as a routine, frequently needed skill rather than an obsolete one. Speaking of poisoners who didn't seem deterred by any of this, consider Mary Ann Cotton, an Englishwoman tried and executed in 1873, whose case is often cited, sometimes with exaggerated numbers, as one of the most extensive arsenic poisoning cases of the Victorian period. Cotton moved through multiple marriages and households over roughly 20 years, during which a striking number of husbands, children, and other relatives in her care died of what were at the time recorded as gastric illnesses. She collected on modest life insurance policies along the way. It was only when a local official, familiar with her pattern and suspicious of one particular death, insisted on a proper investigation that arsenic was found in the body of her stepson, using chemical testing methods descended directly from Marsh's work decades earlier. Reality check. How many deaths was cotton actually responsible for? This is one of the more genuinely contested numbers in Victorian criminal history. Popular accounts often cite figures as high as 21 deaths connected to her, but only one murder, that of her stepson Charles Edward Cotton, was ever formally tried and proven in court, because that was the case where evidence was strong enough to prosecute before further investigation became moot with her execution. What's known? Multiple deaths in households connected to her showed a suspicious pattern. What's proven in a court of law? 1. Historians generally treat the higher totals as plausible but not conclusively established. Why does this matter for the larger story? Because it illustrates something important about how arsenic poisoning cases actually got solved throughout this entire era. Not through routine screening, not through a suspicious doctor automatically testing every death, but through a slow accumulation of social pattern recognition by people around the poisoner, followed by a forensic test that could only be applied once suspicion was already high enough to justify an exhumation. The chemistry could confirm poisoning. It almost never initiated the investigation on its own. This is arguably the single most underappreciated fact about the entire era. Forensic toxicology in the 19th century wasn't a dragnet. It was a confirmation tool, applied narrowly after social suspicion had already done most of the work. Which means the actual determining factor in whether a poisoner got caught wasn't the state of chemistry at all. It was whether the people around them were paying close enough attention and whether anyone with authority was willing to act on that suspicion before the body was buried and forgotten. Now, for something that seems to contradict everything said so far, an unexpected exception worth pausing on. In the mountainous Styria region of Austria, 19th century travelers and physicians documented a genuinely strange local practice. Certain rural inhabitants reportedly consumed small, gradually increasing doses of arsenic, sometimes eaten directly, sometimes mixed into food, as a folk practice believed to improve stamina, complexion, and breathing at high altitude, among other claimed benefits. These arsenic eaters allegedly built up a tolerance that let them consume quantities that would be lethal to someone without that gradual exposure.
Is this actually true or a period medical legend? This one sits firmly in debated territory. 19th century physicians, including some prominent toxicologists, investigated and wrote about the phenomenon, and some scientific interest in arsenic tolerance built up through gradual dosing persisted into the 20th century. However, modern toxicologists have raised real questions about how well documented the specific claimed doses actually were, how they were measured, and whether some accounts were exaggerated or relied on unreliable self-reporting from the arsenic eaters themselves, who had social and even romantic incentive to seem impressively hardy. It's known that gradual tolerance to some level of arsenic exposure is biologically plausible and has some basis in how the body processes and can partially adapt to certain toxins. It's still debated exactly how extreme, verified, and widespread the Styrian practice really was, versus how much became folkloric exaggeration repeated uncritically by fascinated outside observers. Why include something this uncertain in a documentary about arsenic? Because it captures something true about the whole subject. Arsenic's relationship with the human body was never simple. It wasn't just poison equals death, always, immediately. Dose, exposure pattern, individual physiology, and time all mattered enormously, which is exactly the kind of nuance that made it so difficult to prosecute, diagnose, and regulate in the first place. A substance that behaves differently depending on how it's introduced is a much harder substance to build reliable laws and reliable science around. Here's an irony worth sitting with for a moment. While courts were trying to convict people of poisoning others with arsenic, physicians were simultaneously prescribing arsenic compounds as medicine in doses they believed were therapeutic.
Fowler's solution, a diluted potassium arsenite mixture developed in the 1780s, became one of the most widely used medicines in the Western world for well over a century, prescribed for conditions ranging from malaria to skin diseases to, at various points, general weakness and anemia. It remained in reasonably common medical use into the early 20th century. Why would doctors keep prescribing something they knew in other contexts could kill? Because the pharmacological principle at work, one articulated centuries earlier by the physician Paracelsus, was that the dose makes the poison. In small, carefully controlled quantities, arsenic compounds did produce some genuine physiological effects that period medicine interpreted, not always correctly, as therapeutic. Modern medicine has actually circled back to a narrow, carefully controlled version of this idea. Arsenic trioxide, under strict clinical dosing and monitoring, is used today as an approved treatment for a specific type of leukemia, a genuinely surprising modern epilogue to a substance whose entire historical reputation is built on being a murder weapon. Fast fact, the same compound that once quietly enabled inheritance murders across Europe is, in a heavily regulated pharmaceutical form and precisely measured dose, part of a modern cancer treatment protocol. Dose, delivery, and monitoring are the entire difference between a poison and a medicine, a fact 19th century physicians grasped in principle but could rarely apply with modern precision, given how imprecise dosing and measurement tools remained for most of this era. By the final decades of the 19th century, arsenic's dominance as the poisoner's tool of choice was fading, not because criminal ingenuity ran out, but because the entire surrounding system had finally caught up. Forensic toxicology had matured well beyond the Marsh test into more refined, more sensitive chemical procedures. Regulation had made casual purchase harder and had created paper trails, purchase registers, required signatures, restrictions on quantity that made it easier to connect a poisoner to their poison after the fact. Public awareness, fed by heavily reported trials like Cotton's, made juries, neighbors, and attending physicians far more alert to the pattern of a mysterious wasting illness following suspiciously closely behind an inheritance or an insurance payout. And there was a quieter factor too. Alternatives emerged. As the 20th century approached, other poisons and, more significantly, other methods of causing harm that left different, sometimes equally difficult, sometimes easier forensic trails began appearing in criminal casework, diluting arsenic's dominant position simply through the normal churn of criminal fashion and forensic adaptation. Poisoners didn't stop existing. Arsenic simply stopped being the obvious low-risk default it once was. Myth 3 question: was arsenic poisoning ever actually the most common method of murder historically, statistically speaking? Verdict: no, this is a significant popular misconception. Reality: poisoning was disproportionately visible in historical record and popular imagination. It generated sensational trials. It disproportionately involved women as defendants in an era fascinated and alarmed by that fact, and it fit a compelling narrative about hidden domestic danger. But by raw numbers, violent methods of killing consistently outnumbered poisoning across most of the historical record for which reliable criminal statistics exist. Poisoning's cultural footprint was, and remains, far larger than its actual statistical footprint. Why the myth became popular? Poisoning trials made exceptional newspaper copy. A poisoner, often someone trusted and close to the victim, using patience and chemistry rather than violence, patiently administering something with no taste and no smell, one dose at a time, while everyone around them believes they're watching an illness run its natural course. Which raises an even stranger question than how did people get away with it? And that question is, what does it say about a society that an entire category of murder relied, for its success, almost entirely on people trusting the person closest to the dying?
Nearly every well-documented arsenic poisoning case across this 300-year span shares a specific structural feature. The poisoner was rarely a stranger.
They were a spouse, a caregiver, a business partner, a parent, someone whose proximity to the victim during illness wasn't suspicious. It was expected. The entire crime depended on the culturally normal behavior of caring for a sick person being indistinguishable from the mechanics of slowly killing one. That's not a chemistry problem, that's a trust problem, wearing chemistry as a disguise. And it explains something that might otherwise seem odd. Why did detection improve so much faster than prevention? Because chemistry, the Marsh test, refined toxicology, better pathology, could be built in a laboratory, tested, standardized, and deployed. Trust and the vulnerability that comes with it can't be regulated away nearly so cleanly. You cannot legislate suspicion of the person feeding you soup while you're sick without unraveling something essential about how caregiving and family life actually function. Society's gotten much better at proving arsenic poisoning after the fact. They never got especially good at preventing it in the moment, because prevention would have required treating ordinary domestic intimacy as inherently suspect, and no society has ever been willing to live that way. There's a temptation telling a story like this to treat arsenic as some uniquely sinister substance, a villain with a chemical formula, but that's backwards. Arsenic didn't do anything. It sat in the earth, got mined, got processed, got sold as rat poison in wallpaper dye and medicine, entirely indifferent to what anyone did with it afterward. Everything interesting in this story, the murders, the trials, the regulation, the myths, the 3 centuries of near-perfect deniability, came from people. From what they knew, what they didn't know yet, what they were willing to overlook, and what they finally, slowly forced themselves to look at directly. The real story isn't about a poison, it's about the enormous, uneven, centuries-long project of building tools sturdy enough to make truth harder to hide, a project that had nothing to do with arsenic specifically and everything to do with a species that has always been better at trusting each other than at verifying each other, and has spent its entire history quietly trying to close that gap. History isn't strange because people 300 years ago were foolish, credulous, or somehow different from us. History is strange because they were almost exactly like us, reasoning carefully from the evidence they actually had, which simply happened to be much thinner than the evidence we take for granted today. Someday, something we currently trust without a second thought will look to people centuries from now exactly as quaint and dangerous as an unregulated jar of white powder sitting on a Georgian pantry shelf. If you want more videos like this, subscribe.